Aaron said, my name is Stephanie Karhoff. I'm a field specialist with Ohio State Extension focused on agronomic systems, and I'm excited to join you all virtually this morning to talk a little bit more about corn disease management. And today I really want to take a Zoom focus on two diseases that have been pressing issues the past few seasons for Ohio corn growers, that being tar spot and then Gibberella ear rot. So starting with tar spot is a relatively new foliar corn disease for us here in Ohio. It's caused by a fungal pathogen named Phyllocorum matus, and this pathogen is native to the Latin America region and came into the Midwest Corn Belt about 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago, first in Indiana, and then was confirmed in Ohio in late season in 2018. And since then has been really widespread throughout the state. So we've had some really big tar spot years in 2019 and then 2021. And since then, we've seen it consistently across the entire state. And the tar spot fungal pathogen, though it's native to Latin America, where it actually works in tandem with another pathogen, here it infects as a single pathogen and can overwinter in our cornfields in Ohio. So it survives in the soil, crop residue, and then the following season, if we have the right conditions, so having that moisture and high humidity levels, those spores can then infect the corn plant. So we can have those spores being splashed up from the surface, or spore trapping data done by Dr. Pierce Paul, our corn wheat pathologist, in collaboration with other pathologists across the Midwest. Their spore trapping data has also confirmed that these spores can travel in from neighboring fields, even neighboring states. So traveling at least 4,000 feet. So we can have those spores come up from the debris or being blown in from neighboring locations. And when we have the right conditions, it can then infect the corn plant. And about 2 to 3 weeks after infection is when we'll start to see those small raised black spots. And we'll talk more about what those look like when we're scouting in the fields. So 2 take-home messages when you're looking at this cycle of infection is, 1, it can overwinter. So prioritize those fields that do have a history of tar spot where we have that starting source of inoculum and that pathogen can have a jump start to that infection. And then secondly, since spores can travel in via the wind from neighboring fields, neighboring states even, that means we can't rely solely on tillage and rotation to solve this problem. So what conditions are needed for tar spot to take off? And moisture is the primary driver. So having that period of leaf wetness of at least 7 to 8 hours, followed by moderate temperatures. So a little bit cooler than other pathogens. Tar spot pathogen really does well in that 60 to 70 degree Fahrenheit range. And then lastly, relative humidity of more than 75%, which here in Ohio, we're often in that range during the growing season. So I know Aaron's going to be talking later and giving us a weather outlook for this coming year, but even Aaron doesn't have a crystal ball. So we don't know what type of conditions we're going to have, what weather is going to be handed to us this year. So it's hard to know when and if tar spot will be active in your fields. Luckily, we do have tools to really inform us on when we should be scouting these fields to confirm tar spot is active and being able to pinpoint that fungicide application timing. So one tool that is available as a mobile application is called Tar Spotter. So this is available whether you have an Apple or an Android mobile device or tablet. And how this works is it's going to generate a forecast whether you have a low, moderate, high risk of tar spot in that field based off of past research looking at what variables are most important for infection. So that's that humidity, leaf wetness, and etc. And then it's going to combine that with weather information for your location that you input, as well as a few site-specific farmer input that you'll provide. So if you haven't downloaded this app before, this is that first screen that you'll see. And so here on that first icon, you'll be able to enter in any new fields. Once those are entered, you can enter in your nickname for that field, that GPS coordinate. It's going to save that in your field list. That way you don't have to re-enter those every time you use the app. And this is what it looks like when you enter in those field sites for the first name, where you can give it that field name that matches up with your other record keeping and that location based off of either the map or manually inputting that GPS coordinate. And then these are the questions that it's going to ask for each one of those field sites. It's going to give you a default action threshold. So telling us when we need to spray a fungicide in order to prevent any economic losses due to yield being reduced. It's also going to ask if you've already applied a fungicide in the last 2 weeks. So most of our products are giving us a protection window of about 14 days, as well as what growth stage are you currently in? Are we past V10 where we may see a benefit from an application, or are we past R3 and no longer really are going to get as much benefit from that application? And then here's where you can refresh that field information. And it's going to use all that information to give you that forecast. So here you can see that high forecast when this was ran. And you can see it then compares it to that action threshold. So this is one tool. It's not telling you when to spray, but more when that disease is likely to be active. So you can scout, confirm, and then really fine tune that application timing if you have that flexibility on your operation. And then it's been mentioned a few times already this morning, but we also include information on weather forecast, whether that disease is active, and we'll have more in-depth tar spot scouting throughout the state this year through our county extension educators. So be sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe to our corn newsletter. And then we're also active on Facebook, Twitter or X, and YouTube as well. So we know now that TarSpot is active using that TarSpotter app or using other tools like the corn newsletter. What are we looking for when we go out to that field? So early in the season, you want to focus on the lower canopy to mid canopy area of those corn plants and being sure to use multiple areas of that field and not just focusing on, say, the edges of that field. What we're looking for are these circular raised black spots. And these are actually a structure of that fungus called stromata. And when we have the right environmental conditions from that black spot, those spores can then ooze out and spread and cause multiple infection cycles within that growing season. So you can see starting off, they're fairly small, typically circular, and early in the season can be easily confused with insect grass. So these stromata are actually embedded in that leaf surface. So if you would wet your finger or take a towel across that corn leaf, you would not be able to rub it off or remove it. Whereas if it's insect grass, that's easily going to rub off. So it's just a quick tool to be able to differentiate between the two early in the season. And then as it progresses, it's going to elongate and have more of that diamond shape. And in some cases, you can also get, not in this image, but you can get a circular tan or chlorotic region around that called a fisheye lesion. So how do we manage tar spot once we do find it in our fields? And similar to all of our other corn diseases, hybrid selection is going to be that first line of defense. So really the foundation of that disease management program. And this picture right here is just showing corn leaves from different germplasm sources that were actually pulled from Latin America, where this pathogen is native, with the intent of, can we find some natural resistance that we can then breed into our hybrids? And I use it because it's a nice example of the range of resistance that exists. So no hybrid is going to be 100% resistant to tar spot. Even this leaf right here, if you zoom in on the photo, has some stomata. But you can see that we do have resistance available. Since this is a newer corn disease, we did have to play some catch up as far as doing those field trials to be able to understand how the hybrids perform. And until recently had to rely on natural infection to do so. But thankfully, some methods are now in place in industry. That way we can culture this pathogen and inoculate corn plants to do a more systematic controlled screening. That's really going to be helpful to us as growers as we navigate those seed catalogs and try to decide which hybrid is going to give us our best resistance towards tar spot. But even the most resistant hybrid, if we have those right environmental conditions, that high relative humidity, the right temperature range, and that leaf wetness, can still have tar spot occur and may still need a fungicide application. So that application efficacy is going to come down to what product are we using, and then what's the timing of that application. So I want to take time to walk through some results from Dr. Pierce-Paul, our serial pathologist, some fungicide efficacy trials that he's done at our Northwest location in Wood County. So this location has probably the highest history of tar spot compared to our other research stations as it moved from Indiana and other states into Ohio. And I'm going to use 2023 data. We had lower disease this past year, maybe one, if any, of silver lining of that drought. So I want to look at the 2023 data where we did have higher to moderate levels of foliar disease. That way we can look at how these fungicide decisions can be made in that scenario. So first, looking at product. So 4 main products were used in this trial. We have Delero Complete, and that is different from Delero. So here we have that additional active ingredient, as well as Veltima and then Miravis Neo. And looking at the different timings, so first from V10, V14, a single application focused on what those results were by product. We can see at V10, V14, all of our products performed well. So when you're looking at this bar chart, we're looking at the percent control. So how well did it control tar spot compared to our untreated control that had no fungicide applied? And the taller that bar is, the better control we had from that application. So all 3 did well, but Veltima really performed the best at V10 to V14. And that trend continued for applications made at, tasseling to R1, early silking. So where we saw consistent performance from all of them, but Veltima slightly edging them out. And overall, when we look at different products, multiple mode of action products are going to do best against tar spot. They will likely have a higher price point, but that multiple mode of action is our best bet against tar spot when we do have disease come in. And a nice tool that you can use available on cropprotectionnetwork.org. It's a fungicide efficacy chart. So they have this for corn and other field crops like soybean. And what it is our pathologists, along with other states, are combining those fungicide efficacy trials to get a good rating on how well these products do against various diseases that they're labeled against. So when you're looking at that chart, it's going to give you that FRAC code, similar to our mode of action when we're looking at different herbicides, as well as your active ingredient. And then that product trade name that you're probably most familiar with, as well as what rates were tested. And then here it's going to list out different diseases and what that rating is. So here we can see tar spot, and many of these are either good, they might not be labeled NL. And as we go down that chart, we can look at what products are going to give us the best likely control against tar spot. So we select the product that's going to give us the best control, but timing, especially for tar spot, is really important. So here in Ohio, our timing can be really variable based on whether or not that field has history of tar spot, or are we waiting for those spores to travel in? So this past year, tar spot was confirmed probably the earliest. And even earlier, looking at Indiana and Michigan, where tar spot may have more history, especially in the case for Indiana. And so here in Ohio, since that starting point of infection can be really variable based off of field history and environmental conditions, that timing also needs to be flexible. So this same efficacy trial looked at an earlier time to application between V10, V14, and then silking, tasseling, VT to R1, and then a later application at around R2, R3, and then combinations of these. So we did look at single pass versus a 2-pass program in 2023 at Northwest. So looking at the results from all the treatments combined, here we're looking at what that level of disease was on the ear leaf in these plots. So our untreated control that didn't have any fungicide applied, is here in gray. So of course, that's going to be our tallest bar. It had the highest amount of tar spot. And then you can see all of these blue bars are various treatments of products, rates, and timing. Compared to that untreated control, did well. But you can see where those red arrows are. We did have some treatments that really stood out in terms of disease protection. And so in 2023, tar spot came in about mid to later in the season. And so what we found in this year was those treatments that had an R3 application, R3 to R2, are the ones that did the best. So that's an example where tar spot, if we do have the flexibility, if we're not reliant on an aerial applicator or co-op coming in and spraying, we can see some benefit in shifting that application timing if disease comes in later. But keep in mind, across all years and all locations, we see that most consistent benefit at an application anywhere between tasseling and R3, especially for a multiple mode of action product. And once again, looking at all of those treatments, comparing it to that grade check. And then our 15 other treatments, looking at different products or different timing rate, as well as our single pass programs in that solid bar or 2-pass programs in the dashed line bars. We did see a yield increase of 9 to 31 bushels per acre in 2023. So fungicides may not always pay, but when we do have higher disease levels like we did in 2023 at Northwest, we do see that benefit of fungicides broadly when compared to that untreated control. But I know margins are tight this year and looking to get only tighter. So another question is not only how well does it protect yield and protect us from disease, but which programs are going to give us that positive return on investment. So looking at those same results and then using a median price point for those fungicide products. So here I used another tool available on cropprotectionnetwork.org. And this is a return on investment calculator for fungicide products. And so you can select whether you're in a high or low disease severity scenario. So the higher that severity, the less of a yield gain we need to pay for that fungicide application, as well as what your expected yield is. So you know that field history, you know the performance of that hybrid you're selecting, what's your expected yield, as well as what are you expecting to sell for. So here we had $4.59 per bushel. And then it's going to give you a median price point based off of the entire nation for these products. So I used it as a starting point here and then refined it working with some local input retailers. And when we look at those 15 fungicide programs, 2 gave us a negative return on investment. So treatment 6 and treatment 12. And the common thread between those 2 were they were 2 pass programs, but that first pass, was done earlier. So here in treatment 6, we had Veltima applied at V10 to V12, followed by an application at tasseling to R1. And then similarly in treatment 12, we had Delaro at V5 to V7, followed by tasseling to R1 with that same product. So overall, in this year and other years, we don't see a strong case for a 2-pass program. I think that's reserved for more of a higher disease environment when we are already past 2 weeks of our prior first fungicide application, and we're seeing that environment, those weather conditions that are going to allow that tar spot pathogen to cause multiple infection cycles. But overall, don't see that consistent benefit of a 2-pass program so far. So some take-home messages for tar spot before I shift gears and talk about Gibberella ear rot and vomitoxin are first to avoid those susceptible hybrids. So work with your seed representative as well as other resources available to you to avoid those susceptible hybrids. But do know those spores are traveling in from long distances. So even if you have a field that's never had tar spot before, it can still be vulnerable to infection. And then though we can have that resistant hybrid, the right conditions, it may still need that fungicide application. And so understanding that our most consistent benefit is going to be coming from a multiple mode of action product, and timing that between tasseling to R2, R3 is going to give us the best edge. And then as we shift to talk about Gibberella ear rot, I want to always remind ourselves that we shouldn't get tar spot tunnel vision. Is a phrase that University of Wisconsin-Madison's pathologist coined in a webinar that I really like, where it's a newer disease. It can escalate quickly in fields with the right conditions, especially irrigated fields where we have that moisture consistently. But we don't want to lose sight of our other disease threats, other foliar diseases like northern or gray leaf spot. And especially we don't want to lose sight of Gibberella ear rot that we'll talk about here today, because that can not only reduce our yield, but also make it hard to market that grain if we have the vomitoxin contamination. So with that, I'll take a quick pause and check the Q&A box. Ryan, do we have any Q&As right now or any questions?
As of right now, I don't think we have any Q&A. We again encourage those folks to put your questions in that Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen many times on our Zoom application. But I don't see any right now, Steph.
Okay.
So yeah, I think you're okay to continue. Yeah.
All right, so I'll keep talking, but shifting gears towards Gibberella ear rot. So Gibberella ear rot, it's caused by another fungal pathogen called Fusarium graminearum, and you may also see this name Gibberella Z, depending on what the structure and what the form of that fungus is. But Fusarium graminearum here in Ohio, it's everywhere. And that's because it has a wide host range. So not only does it cause ear rot and stalk rot in corn, but it's also the causal agent of Fusarium head blight or head scab in wheat. And then it can also infect soybean. So it can infect soybean at the root seedling stage and cause some damping off, some reduced emergence there as well. And has even been shown to infect alfalfa too. So crop rotation typically is that cornerstone of managing diseases. It's not going to help us here as far as rotating out of Fusarium graminearum in our fields. So in corn, Fusarium can overwinter in that corn or wheat residue at the soil surface. And then similar to when we were talking about tar spot, we can have that rainfall splash those spores up. And then in the case of Fusarium, it's actually going to infect the corn plant through that silk channel. So either through the silk channel, just as a pollen grain would enter, or if we have a damage to that corn ear from insect feeding, for example, those are how fusarium can enter the corn plant. And then if we have the right conditions, so wet, high relative humidity, that's when infection can start. And we may see some obvious signs later on the year. You can see that red to pinkish mold growth, typically at the tip of the ear of that corn plant. And then the real kicker for this disease is when infection occurs, this fungus can then create a mycotoxin called vomitoxin or DON. And we know that can cause dockage when we're marketing that grain at the elevator, and it's going to have adverse effects when we're feeding that out to livestock, especially swine. So because that pathogen is infecting through the silk channel, when we're talking about fungicide application, silk coverage is especially critical for this disease. But that's a real challenge in corn compared to wheat. When we're spraying that wheat field, our target, that wheat head, is at the top and more accessible as we're making that application. Whereas the corn ear, it's hidden underneath that canopy. And depending on our application method, we may not be able to get that coverage that we need on the silks. So thanks to a really tremendous investment by the Ohio Corn Checkoff program, here at Ohio State, we're working on comparing different application methods on how well they coverage that corn ear, and then how well does it protect us against gibberella ear rot and DON or vomitoxin accumulation. And so we don't have results from this year. We just got our results back from our grain testing that we send out to then get those DON levels. And unfortunately, the drought and hurricane hurt us too in terms of plots that we were able to take data off of. But this trial, widely, it's comparing high clearance ground sprayer with a traditional boom setup to one that has drops. And then also comparing that to how well does a drone do? So using two different drone setups, DJI and then a Helio drone with different nozzle types. We're comparing not only the coverage by putting some water sensitive paper cards on these corn plants before application and then taking them down to see how well those droplets cover that card. And then also coming back and rating disease, taking yield, and then sending those corn grain samples off to get our DON levels. So this is an exciting project for us. One limitation of our small plot trials is we can't have an airplane treatment, just the nature of those small plots. So an on-farm research opportunity for all of you to take advantage of is working with OSU Extension. We can compare two different application methods on your farm. So that could be looking at a drone and a sprayer. It could be looking at a drone versus an airplane, or vice versa, an airplane against that high clearance sprayer. And working with us, we'll make sure those are replicated, randomized trials. That way we know the data we're taking can be applied in a wider sense and is reliable. But that's an opportunity. If anyone's interested, they can reach out directly to me or our eFields team or your county extension office, and we can work through the details of setting that up on your farm. So application method is critical with gibberella ear rot, and one that we're exploring in ongoing research. But timing is just as important as that method. So some work that's been done along with collaborators in Ontario, Canada, that also seem to have this vomitoxin reoccurring issue, focused in that Great Lakes region really, is looking at what timing is best for controlling that DON accumulation for our fungicide applications. So here you can see the labels are slightly different than what we're used to seeing for vomitoxin and DON. So here, slightly different. So those numbers are going to look a lot higher than our parts per million that we're used to. But this green bar right here is our untreated control. And that green bar, or excuse me, the green bar is our total DON accumulation, and the leftermost bar is our untreated control. And just a reminder, like Laura had said, for the battle for the belt, when those letters here at the top of the bar are the same, those results are statistically the same. So depending on what threshold level we used, we could expect, for example, 90% of the time, these treatments to perform the same in that field. So what this trial found was that full silking, so that early silking period, gave us the best control as far as DON accumulation compared to that untreated control. But we know that's variable in the field, and weather may throw a wild card on when we can get into the field to make that application. So if you're asking yourself whether it's better to be late versus early, if you can't hit that full silking, what this study and others that have been repeated have showed pretty consistently is it's better to err on the earlier side. So if we are at full tassel, we can still see really great DON control. Versus if we are at full silking plus 5 days, here we can see that DON vomitoxin accumulation take off. And then once we're 11 days past that silking point, now we're not seeing any benefit that fungicide application. So you notice we see an A here and an A here for untreated control. When we're that far past silking, statistically, it's the same as if we had sprayed no fungicide at all. So weather is a huge variable in terms of how well that fungicide application is going to do and when disease is going to come in. So another ongoing project that we're doing right now, thanks to that funding from the Corn Checkoff program, is refining a forecasting system for vomitoxin. So can we predict based off of the weather conditions, your location, how likely are we supposed to get, how likely is it that we'll get 2, 4, 8 parts per million in terms of vomitoxin? So right now we're in the early stages of this forecasting system where manually entering our relative humidity and our temperature is going to give us that risk. So you can see as we have more hours at a relative humidity more than 90%, and as we have higher temperatures for a longer period of time, we're in this red corner. That's our highest risk of having vomitoxin levels in our corn, compared to here in the blue where we have a lower risk. So right now we're in the early stages, and if you're subscribed to the corn newsletter during the season, we put out what the forecast is for the locations we have weather stations available for. And then as this progresses, our goal is it will be easier for you to pull up on your mobile device or laptop and be able to use it in a similar way to the wheat fusarium head blight forecasting tool, where all you have to do is enter in your location and it's going to show you a map and what that risk coverage looks like on that map. And then here we've got our crew that installed weather stations this past year and used that as a boots on the ground way to validate this forecasting system by having that weather station data on site and then following up after harvest to collect grain samples and verify what vomitoxin levels we were at for those fields. And then just as tar spot, our hybrid selection is really key to managing Gibberella ear rot. So it can be resistant levels or different characteristics of that hybrid. So here you can see a really nice image showing the difference between whether that ear drops down later closer to harvest or if it stays upright. So we can see here this upright ear, it's more likely to hold on to that moisture. So say if it rains or we have heavy dew, it's going to stay in that husk and pool. And that's going to give a great environment for Gibberella to continue growing and continue producing vomitoxin. So you can see where we have that pink mold growth on the tip of that corn ear compared to if we drop down, now we're not collecting that moisture at the base of the corn ear. So To provide better information to growers on terms of how hybrids perform for gibberella ear rot severity and vomitoxin accumulation, we started in 2023 a resistance screening program. So how this works is seed companies can submit their hybrids that are commercially available to Ohio growers. And then we have 3 different locations: Bucyrus, Apple Creek, and South Charleston, where we have plots that are inoculated. So here you can see a backpack sprayer in that inoculation at the silks of that corn plant to increase our disease levels. And then we also have naturally infected plots for those hybrids. And so they're blocked by relative maturity, and then there's 2 different inoculation periods. That way we can hopefully hit a wide range of silking for all of those hybrids. And then those are then taken to yield, and then that yield is shared, as well as what the vomitoxin levels were in those grain samples. So in this past year, in 2024, we had 89 hybrids from 11 different companies in this past year. And though we had, low vomitoxin across our locations and hybrids, mostly from that drier environment that we had this past year, we did see hybrids that consistently were lower in vomitoxin and not statistically significant to our low checks compared to those that were consistently above 1 parts per million this year at those locations. So use this with caution. We don't have every hybrid available in Ohio in this screening program. And please be aware that it's going to change from year to year as far as what that infection potential is from one year to the next. So best case scenario, if you have a hybrid that was included in 2023 and 2024, you can use both years to really decide how well that hybrid does. So our 2024 results, they were just published 2 weeks ago, and you can find them directly at go.osu.edu vomitoxin. And so that's going to include all 89 hybrids, all 3 locations, inoculated and naturally infected. And then our 2023 results are also available at go.osu.edu DON 2023. So some take-home messages for Gibberella and vomitoxin are: first, just like any disease, avoiding those susceptible hybrids. So use that screening program when you're sitting down selecting hybrids for future years, but also communicating with your agronomist, your seed representative, that vomitoxin is an issue for you and it's one that needs to be addressed industry-wide. That way we can protect ourselves against it. And then for Gibberella, that efficacy is really variable because we're trying to get that silk coverage that's difficult because that ear is hidden under the canopy. So application method, silking variability, ear position, hybrid, and more are all going to come into play on how well that fungicide protects us. And then when we're applying, focusing on that early silk, and if we can't reach that, earlier rather than later for that application. In terms of fungicide products, those that have been most consistent for us in our trials have been Miravis Neo and Proline. And then the advantage of that Miravis Neo is you're gaining another active ingredient compared to Proline that is going to help also with foliar diseases. So this isn't to say that these are the only 2 products and they're always going to provide a benefit, but based on our trials across multiple locations, multiple years, they're the most consistently effective. And then making sure to dry and store harvested grain at or below 15% moisture, and then routinely coming back and checking that grain is really important in terms of vomitoxin control. So if we're storing that grain above 15%, that fusarium that's already there can continue to produce more and more vomitoxin. So that's why it's important to make sure that we're drying that grain down and then hopefully having a timely harvest so we're not leaving it out in the field to increase levels as well. Another thing to keep in mind are what settings we have on that combine at harvest. So the fines are really what's going to have the highest level of vomitoxin. So adjusting our settings, that way we can hopefully blow that off and remove those fines that are going to cause a spike often in our vomitoxin levels. So lots of acknowledgements to make this work happen. A lot of this research was done by Pierce Paul and his team, as well as our collaborators. Jason Hartshoe, our field specialist in dairy and precision livestock, has been a tremendous asset to addressing vomitoxin, as well as Rich Mignot, who has headed up the resistant screening program trials. And then for our fungicide application method, it takes a small army to put out those water sensitive papers and do those different applications and gather the data. So huge hats off to John Fulton and FABE, as well as his graduate students, Alex Thomas, Grace Hoppelman, and Alan Leininger. And then we had some local extension educators, including Kendall Lovejoy, Amber Emmons, Kyle Karhoff, and others that also helped us with that field work. And then, as always, none of these trials would be possible without our station managers. So we've got Matt Davis at Northwest and Joe Davlin at Western that do a great job taking our crazy ideas and making them happen. And then last, but certainly not least, for the vomitoxin work, that's thanks to what I referenced earlier, a really tremendous investment by the Ohio Corn Checkoff to leave no stone unturned and really get after vomitoxin management here in Ohio. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you may have. I'll check the Q&A box, but I'm not seeing any right now.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I don't see any there now. I think when we think about corn disease management and things there, to me, and maybe you want to just reiterate this, there's three kind of take-home messages to corn disease management: variety selection, fungicide timing, and what's the weather going to do? I think if we look at any kind of disease, that's what we're looking at. Would you agree?
I agree, yes.
Yeah.
So hybrid selection, huge. Then developing that fungicide program. And then lastly, if you got Aaron Wilson on speed dial, that's probably your best chance
That's
on
your
figuring
best
out
bet.
what
There
the
you
weather is
go.
going to do. So good that
Exactly.
we've got him on our agenda today.
Yep. One last, I do have a question that we talk about DON levels and Voxman levels in their corn and that. I believe there is some research going on in terms of grain cleaning. If you do have that, you talked about the fines being high content. I believe you have some research on that through our OSU extension team. Is that correct?
Yes, so that same corn checkoff program, I didn't have time to include it today, but grain cleaning is also another question included in that project. So is there a maybe higher throughput way can we clean that grain and be able to, yes, remove those fines and those smaller pieces that are going to spike those DOM levels when we're bringing them up to sell?
Yeah. So more research happening on this through OSU Extension, and so we're greatly appreciative of that we can continue to bring great information to all producers.